For 434 years, Norway did not exist. Its flag was erased, its language suppressed, and its people governed from foreign capitals in Copenhagen and Stockholm. 4 centuries is longer than the entire history of the United States. Yet Norwegian identity never died. When independence finally came in 1905, it came without a single shot fired, the result of a centuries-long refusal to be forgotten. But that moment of quiet triumph was only one chapter in a story stretching back more than 12,000 years. A story of Viking warlords and medieval kings, of Nazi occupation and miraculous resistance, of fishermen who became billionaires almost overnight when black gold was found beneath the North Sea. This is the entire history of Norway, and it is far stranger and far greater than you have been told. 10,000 years before the first saga was ever spoken aloud, before the long ships and the Vikings and the great Norse kingdoms, there was only ice. The Scandinavian ice sheet had blanketed the land for tens of thousands of years, a crushing, silent weight stretching from horizon to horizon. But around 10,000 BC, something shifted. The climate warmed, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. Glaciers that had stood for millennia began to crack and groan and retreat northward, and as they did, an extraordinary landscape emerged beneath them. Dramatic fjords carved by ancient ice now open to the sea. Coastal archipelagos surfaced like the backs of sleeping giants. For the first time in an age, there was land to walk on. And people came. Following the retreating ice, almost as soon as it moved, 2 distinct cultures arrived along Norway's emerging coastline. In the south and west came the Fosnahensbacka people, moving up from continental Europe across the land bridges and narrow channels of a world where sea levels were still dramatically lower than today. Simultaneously along the far northern shores, the Kamsa culture settled what is now Finnmark, likely arriving from the east across land now submerged beneath the Barents Sea. These were not the crude primitives of popular imagination. They were sophisticated, adaptable hunter-gatherers who understood their environment with extraordinary precision. What did their world look like? Imagine a coastline teeming with life. Vast schools of cod and herring in the cold fjord waters. Seals basking on exposed rocks. Reindeer grazing the tundra that spread behind the shore. These earliest Norwegians built their lives around this abundance, paddling the protected coastal waters in skin boats, hunting with bone harpoons, reading the weather and the tides with the knowledge that survival depended on getting it right every single time. They left behind more than bones and tools. At Alta in the far north and at scattered sites along the Norwegian coast, these ancient peoples carved images directly into rock. Reindeer in mid-gallop. Bears. Human figures. Boats. The Alta rock carvings, created over thousands of years beginning around this period, represent one of Europe's most remarkable prehistoric archives, so significant that they now carry UNESCO World Heritage status. These were not idle scratches. They were records, rituals, perhaps prayers. They were people announcing their presence to whatever forces governed the world around them. By 4000 BC, Norway had been inhabited for 6,000 years. Generations beyond counting had been born, lived, and died along these shores. The land itself was still changing, still rising as it recovered from the weight of the ice, a process geologists call isostatic rebound that continues even today. The foundation was laid. The stage was set. And soon, new peoples carrying new technologies from the south would arrive to change everything. The new peoples arrived with bronze. Beginning around 1800 BC, Scandinavia entered a transformative age driven not by conquest but by commerce. Amber, that golden resinous treasure found in abundance along Baltic shores, became one of the ancient world's most coveted luxury goods. Mediterranean traders wanted it desperately, and Scandinavian peoples were sitting on enormous quantities. In exchange, they received something equally precious: bronze, the revolutionary alloy of copper and tin that was reshaping civilizations from Greece to Egypt. Norwegian and broader Scandinavian societies were suddenly plugged into a trading network spanning thousands of miles. Craftsmen learned to work bronze into weapons, jewelry, and ritual objects of remarkable sophistication. The famous bronze lures, great curving horn instruments found in Scandinavian bogs, suggest a culture with complex ceremonial life and artistic ambition. Rock carvings from this period, distinct from the earlier Alta images, depict ships with crews, sun discs, and armed warriors. These were societies growing more hierarchical, more organized, more conscious of power and prestige. Iron arrived around 500 BC, gradually at first, then completely. Unlike bronze, iron ore existed locally in Scandinavia, and mastery of smelting it created a slow but profound independence from distant trade networks. Tools improved. Farmland expanded as better axes cleared forests. Germanic tribal societies consolidated around chieftains who controlled territory, distributed wealth, and maintained loyalty through generosity and force. Then Rome cast its long shadow northward. During what archaeologists call the Roman Iron Age, roughly the first 4 centuries of the Common Era, Roman goods flowed into Scandinavia in striking quantities. Norwegian burial mounds from this period have yielded Roman bronze vessels, glass cups, coins, and fine weaponry. These were not Roman conquests. Rome never reached Norway. Instead, they represent the gravitational pull of the empire's vast commercial network, drawing luxury goods to chieftains eager to display their status and connections to a wider world. Contact with Rome did something else equally important. It accelerated the development of runic writing. The earliest runic inscriptions, using the alphabet scholars call Elder Futhark, appear in Scandinavia around the 2nd century AD. These were not initially administrative records, but rather magical inscriptions, names, dedications, protective formulas carved into weapons and memorial stones. The migration period of the 400s and 500s AD brought upheaval across Europe as Rome collapsed and peoples moved across the continent. In Norway, this pressure paradoxically strengthened local power structures. Petty chieftains consolidated territories, competed through warfare, and gradually shaped the regional identities that would become the basis for Norwegian kingdoms. A distinctly Norse language and cultural identity crystallized across this period. By the late 700s AD, the descendants of those first coastal hunters had become something entirely new. Organized. Ambitious. Literate in their own fashion. Armed with superior ships and weapons and hungry for what lay beyond the horizon. The age of the Vikings was about to begin. On the 8th of June, 793 AD, something changed in the world. The monks of Lindisfarne Monastery, seated on a small tidal island off the northeastern coast of England, had built one of the most celebrated centers of Christian learning in the known world. They illuminated manuscripts. They prayed. They believed, as monasteries generally did, that their distance from the mainland offered a kind of protection. That morning, it offered them nothing. Ships appeared from the north. Long, shallow-hulled vessels with carved prow heads and striped sails, moving with an impossible speed that no vessel these monks had ever seen could match. The men who poured onto the shore were not traders. They came with axes and purpose. By the time it was over, the monastery lay plundered, several monks lay dead, and others had been dragged back toward those terrifying ships. A scholar named Alcuin, writing from the court of Charlemagne, expressed what all of Christian Europe felt in his horrified letter afterward. "Never before," he wrote, "had such a terror appeared in Britain." But the Vikings had not simply appeared from nowhere. Their arrival on that Northumbrian shore was the culmination of generations of change pressing outward from the Norwegian coastline and fjords. The problem was geography, and it was relentless. Norway's terrain offered breathtaking beauty and almost nothing else. Roughly 3% of the land was arable. Mountain ranges cut communities off from each other. The growing season was short, the soil thin, and the forests thick. As population grew through the 700s, the pressure on available farmland became unbearable. Younger sons of chieftains found themselves with status, ambition, and no land to inherit. That combination, across generations, produced men with nothing to lose and everything to gain. What made them terrifying rather than merely desperate was technology. Norwegian shipbuilders had spent generations perfecting what would become the most advanced seafaring vessel in the world. The longship was a marvel of flexible, overlapping planks, a clinker-built hull that could bend and flex in open ocean swells rather than cracking against them. It drew so little water that it could be driven directly onto beaches or rowed far up rivers. It was simultaneously an ocean-crossing vessel and an inland raider. No harbor was safe. No river was a barrier. The men who crewed those ships carried a worldview that made combat not merely acceptable but sacred. Norse religion centered on a pantheon of volatile warrior gods, with Odin at its summit. Odin, the Allfather, was the god of war, wisdom, and death, a one-eyed figure who had sacrificed immeasurably for knowledge and who demanded sacrifice in return. Warriors believed that death in battle guaranteed entrance to Valhalla, his great hall, where the honored dead would feast and fight until the final apocalyptic battle of Ragnarok. To die in bed was, in some traditions, a fate worse than death itself. This was not mere poetry. It shaped the psychology of men rowing toward armed coastlines. After Lindisfarne came the monastery at Jarrow in 794. Then Iona, that sacred island off Scotland's western coast, was struck in 795 and again in 802 when the raiders killed 68 monks. Ireland felt the violence almost immediately, its undefended coastal monasteries presenting the same irresistible combination of wealth, isolation, and minimal resistance. By the first decades of the 900s, Norse raiders had established seasonal patterns, appearing each spring when the seas calmed and the days lengthened, plundering through summer and vanishing back northward before winter closed the sea lanes. European chroniclers wrote of them with a mixture of terror and bewilderment. Their prayers began including a now famous plea, "From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us." Yet raiding was only the first movement of a much larger story. The The same restless energy and maritime mastery that sent men toward Lindisfarne's treasures would soon propel others toward something more permanent, toward settlement, toward trade routes stretching from Baghdad to Newfoundland, and toward the building of a Norse world that would reshape the map of Europe entirely. The longships did not stop at raiding. By the middle of the 9th century, something had shifted in the Norse relationship with the Western world. The axes were still there, but alongside them came something more durable: the intention to stay. The Faroe Islands, those wind-swept specks of rock rising from the North Atlantic roughly halfway between Norway and Iceland, had been known to Irish monks for generations. The Norse arrived in force around the 820s and 830s, bringing livestock, timber, and families. They did not raid the Faroes. They claimed them. Here was a pattern that would repeat itself across the North Atlantic. A people who had mastered the ocean deciding that mastery entitled them to everything beyond it. Iceland followed. Around 870, a Norwegian chieftain named Ingolf Arnarsson drove his carved wooden pillars into the water as his ship approached the Icelandic coast, following them to wherever the currents carried them ashore. Where they landed, he built his farm. He called the place Reykjavik, meaning Smoky Bay, for the geothermal steam rising from the ground. Within decades, thousands of Norse settlers had followed, many of them Norwegian chieftains fleeing the consolidating power of Harald Fairhair, who was forcibly unifying Norway's fractured kingdoms beneath a single crown. Iceland offered something Harald could not touch: distance. While settlers pushed west, warriors and traders were reshaping the British Isles and continental Europe simultaneously. The Orkney and Shetland Islands became effectively Norse territories, their original Pictish populations absorbed or displaced, their place names transformed into Norse words that survive to this day. From those island bases, Norse influence extended deep into Scotland's western coast and the Hebrides, creating a maritime corridor that connected Norway to Ireland within a few days' sailing. In Ireland, what had begun as raiding transformed into something more complex. Norse settlers established fortified harbor towns at strategic coastal points, the most significant being a settlement on the River Liffey that the Norse called Dyflin. Modern Dublin. By the mid-9th century, it had become a functioning Norse kingdom, a trading hub where Irish slaves, Frankish wine, and Rhenish swords changed hands beneath a sky full of sail. A similar transformation occurred across the Irish Sea. Norse forces seized York in 866, renaming it Jorvik, and built a kingdom in northern England that would persist for nearly a century. The reach of Norwegian trade networks during this era astonishes even now. Norse merchants traveled river routes through what is now Russia, portaging their boats between waterways to reach the Black Sea and the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. Arab geographers wrote detailed descriptions of Norse traders arriving in Baghdad. Silver dirhams minted in the Islamic world have been excavated from Norwegian burial mounds, physical proof that the North Atlantic and the Silk Road were connected through Norwegian enterprise. Then came Eric. Eric Thorvaldsson, known to history as Eric the Red, was a man shaped entirely by his own violent temperament. Exiled from Iceland around 982 for manslaughter, he sailed west into genuinely unknown waters and found a massive, ice-fringed landmass. He spent 3 years exploring its coastline, then returned to Iceland with a salesman's instinct, naming the place Greenland because, as the saga's record with almost comic honesty, he thought the attractive name would draw settlers. It worked. Around 985, roughly 25 ships carrying several hundred Norse colonists established 2 permanent settlements on Greenland's southwestern coast. The Norse world now stretched from the rivers of Russia to the edge of the known world. But the edge, it turned out, was not the end. Someone was about to sail past it entirely. Eric the Red's son had inherited his father's restlessness. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson sailed southwest from Greenland with a crew of roughly 35 men, following reports of strange coastlines spotted years earlier by a merchant blown off course. What Leif found would remain the most consequential voyage in Norse history, and one of the most consequential in all of human history. He called it Vinland. The name likely referred to wild grapes, or perhaps wild grasses, depending on which scholar you ask, but the land itself was real, fertile, and unmistakably part of a continent the Norse had no framework to understand. Leif's crew wintered there, built shelters, and returned to Greenland with timber, a resource Greenland desperately lacked. The voyages that followed came quickly. His brother Thorvald sailed to Vinland and was killed there, struck by an arrow during a violent encounter with the indigenous people the Norse called Skrælings. His sister-in-law Gudrid and a merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni led a more ambitious expedition, perhaps 160 people, with the explicit intention of establishing a permanent colony. They failed. The reasons were straightforward. The Norse were too few, too far from any support, and the indigenous populations they encountered proved both numerous and unwilling to accommodate strangers with weapons. After roughly 3 years of intermittent trade and violent conflict, the colonists abandoned Vinland and sailed back to Greenland. North America would not see European settlement again for nearly 5 centuries. For almost 1,000 years, the Vinland voyages existed only in the saga literature, magnificent oral traditions eventually written down in Iceland during the 13th century. The Greenlander's saga and the saga of Eric the Red preserve these journeys in vivid, specific detail. But scholars long debated whether they described genuine history or elaborated myth. Then, in the early 1960s, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad followed a local tip to a remote headland on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada. What they found at a place called Lansay Auk Meadows changed everything. Beneath the turf lay the unmistakable remnants of Norse construction. 8 buildings, a smithy with iron slag, a bronze ring-headed pin of distinctly Norse design, and a spindle whorl indicating the presence of women. Radiocarbon dating placed the site firmly around the year 1000. This was not myth. This was archaeology. Lanseo Meadows is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as the first confirmed European settlement in the Americas, predating Columbus by approximately 500 years. The Norse did not change the history of the Americas. Their failure to establish permanence meant no lasting contact, no sustained exchange, no cultural collision of the kind that would reshape the world after 1492. And yet the achievement itself demands recognition. These were people navigating open ocean without instruments, reading stars, currents, and the behavior of seabirds, crossing roughly 3,000 miles of North Atlantic in wooden vessels no longer than a modern city bus. The saga writers knew what they had witnessed mattered. They preserved these stories through centuries of oral tradition with remarkable accuracy, and in doing so gave us something irreplaceable, the memory of the moment human exploration reached its furthest western edge. Back in Norway itself, the same era that produced Leif Erikson was producing something equally transformative, though far closer to home. A faith was arriving on Norwegian shores, carried by kings with political ambitions as much as spiritual ones, and it would permanently alter the Norse world from the inside out. Long before a single faith reshaped Norway, the land itself was divided. Imagine a coastline of extraordinary complexity, thousands of islands and fjords carving the western edge of Scandinavia into isolated pockets of settlement, each valley and inlet answering to its own chieftain, its own laws, its own sense of sovereign identity. These were the petty kingdoms of early Norway, dozens of them, proud and fiercely independent, connected by the sea but rarely by loyalty. Into this fractured world came Harald, son of Halfdan the Black, a young king from Vestfold on the western shore of the Oslofjord. The sagas tell a story almost too romantic to resist. Harald, it is said, vowed never to cut or comb his hair until he had united all of Norway under his rule. Whether that oath was ever truly made, the ambition behind it was genuine and ferocious. Around the year 872, that ambition reached its decisive moment. At Hafrsfjord, near what is today the city of Stavanger, Harald's fleet met a coalition of western chieftains and jarls who had united specifically to stop him. The battle was hard fought and won decisively. Harald emerged from the waters of Hafrsfjord as something Norway had never seen before. A king who claimed authority over the entire realm. But what did that actually mean? Here the history grows complicated and far more interesting. Harald's victory was real, but the kingdom it created was fragile and deeply personal. Norway was not a nation in any modern sense. It was a collection of regions where power flowed through relationships, through oaths sworn between men who expected those oaths to be honored. Harald controlled Norway because regional strongmen accepted his supremacy, not because any administrative machinery enforced it. Central to Norwegian political life were the ting assemblies, open-air gatherings where free men came together to settle disputes, declare laws, and hold their leaders to account. The Gulating in the west, the Frostating in Trondheim, the Eidsivating in the east, these were ancient institutions that predated Harald and would long outlast him. A king who ignored the tings did so at his considerable peril. Power in Norway was always negotiated, never simply imposed. Harald's greatest political problem was not his enemies. It was his sons. He fathered perhaps 20 of them by multiple wives and concubines, and Norse inheritance custom offered no clean solution to what happened next. When Harald died around the year 930, the kingdom did not pass intact to a single heir. It fractured almost immediately into succession wars of exhausting complexity. His son Eric Bloodaxe seized power briefly, earned his memorable nickname through ruthless violence, and was then driven out by his own brother Hakon, who had been raised at the English court of King Athelstan and brought Christian sympathies back to Norway with him. What followed across the next century was a grinding contest between Harald's descendants and the powerful jarls of Lade in Trondheim, men who controlled the north and proved themselves capable of checking any king who overreached. The Earls of Lade were not rebels against Norwegian unity so much as a reminder of what Norwegian unity actually looked like. A negotiated arrangement among powerful men, not a submission to royal authority. True unification, the kind where a king's word carried genuine force from the southern tip of the country to the northern fishing grounds, would require something beyond military victory. It would require a new organizing principle, something capable of rewriting the social and political foundations of Norwegian life entirely. That principle was already arriving. The same Christian faith that had touched Hakon the Good was gathering strength across Scandinavia. carried by missionaries and enforced by kings who understood that a shared religion could bind a fractious people far more effectively than any battlefield victory. Two kings in particular, Olav Tryggvason and Olav Haraldsson, the man history would eventually call Saint Olav, would test that proposition with extraordinary violence and extraordinary consequence. The ship that carried Olav Tryggvason back to Norway in 995 was more than a vessel. It was a declaration. Baptized in England, hardened by years of Viking raiding, Olaf arrived at the Norwegian coast with two things most kings lacked: genuine military force and absolute religious conviction. He would use both without hesitation. His methods were not subtle. In the fjord communities of western Norway, Olaf gave local chieftains a straightforward choice: accept baptism or face consequences that ranged from the destruction of their property to something considerably worse. At least one pagan holdout, the sorcerer Raud the Strong, met his end in a manner the sagas record with grim specificity. The old gods were not simply being replaced. They were being humiliated, their sacred sites dismantled, their symbols torn down by a king who understood that religious transformation required visible, undeniable acts. Yet Olaf's campaign moved quickly because it also offered something real. Christianity brought Norway into a wider European world, a network of kingdoms, trade relationships, and shared legitimacy that paganism simply could not provide. For ambitious men watching from the sidelines, the new faith was not merely a spiritual matter. It was an alignment with the future. That future was cut short at the Sea Battle of Svold in the year 1000. Ambushed by a coalition of enemies including the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard and the Swedish king Olaf Skotkonung, Olaf Tryggvason fought from the deck of his great longship the Long Serpent until further resistance became impossible. He leapt into the sea and was never seen again. Norway fell back under Danish influence, and the Christian project appeared to stall. But the seeds had been planted. When Olaf Haraldsson seized the Norwegian throne in 1015, he found a country partly Christian in name and almost entirely pagan in practice. He set about changing that with the same determination and much of the same violence as his predecessor. Churches rose across the country. Bishops were installed. Laws were rewritten to reflect Christian moral codes, making the old religious practices not merely unfashionable but illegal. Where Tryggvason had moved like a storm, Haraldsson moved like a siege. Systematic, patient, thorough. He also made powerful enemies among the Norwegian aristocracy, men who found his centralizing ambitions far more threatening than his religious ones. When the Danish king Snut, master of an empire stretching from England to Denmark, offered those enemies support, they took it. In 1030, Olaf Haraldsson marched to reclaim his kingdom and met a Norwegian army at Stiklestad near Trondheim. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The battle on the 29th of July killed him, and with him, it seemed, the last serious challenge to Danish dominance. History rarely follows the script written by the victors. Within a year of Stiklestad, reports of miracles at Olaf's grave began circulating. His body, exhumed and found reportedly incorrupt, was declared saintly. The cult of Saint Olaf spread with remarkable speed, fueled partly by genuine popular devotion and partly by those who found, in a martyred Norwegian king, a powerful symbol of resistance to foreign rule. The Danes, sensing the danger, eventually withdrew. Olaf's son Magnus returned to take the throne. And Norway entered the next phase of its existence with something it had never quite possessed before: a shared sacred story. A national saint whose feast day on the 29th of July is still observed today, and a church structure that gave the kingdom genuine institutional permanence. A faith born in violence had become the cornerstone of Norwegian identity. The question now was what that identity would build. The man who would define the final chapter of the Viking Age was already a legend before he ever sat on a throne. Harald Sigurdsson, known to history as Hardrada, meaning hard ruler, had spent 15 years in the service of the Byzantine Empire as a Varangian Guard, the elite Norse mercenary force that protected the emperors of Constantinople. He had fought in Bulgaria, Sicily, and the Holy Land. He had accumulated wealth on a scale that staggered contemporaries. When he finally returned north and claimed the Norwegian throne in 1047, he brought with him not just gold but something rarer: a military mind sharpened against the most sophisticated armies in the known world. For nearly 2 decades, Harald ruled Norway with the iron competence his nickname promised. He warred with Denmark, founded the city of Oslo, and bent the Norwegian nobility to his will through a combination of force and cunning that kept rivals perpetually off balance. He was, by almost any measure, the last great Viking king in the ancient mold. Aggressive, brilliant, restless. A man who understood power as something seized, not inherited. Which makes his final gamble both comprehensible and extraordinary. In the autumn of 1066, the English throne sat vacant, disputed between 3 claimants. Harald saw his opening. He crossed the North Sea with a fleet estimated at 300 ships and perhaps 9,000 men, one of the largest invasion forces Norway had ever launched. He swept into northern England with the confidence of a man who had never truly lost. On the 25th of September, 1066, Harald Hardrada met the English army under King Harold Godwinson at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire. The Norse forces, caught without their full armor on a warm late summer morning, were attacked before they could properly form. The battle was savage and brief. Harald Hardrada died on the field, an arrow in his throat according to the sagas. Of the 300 ships that had crossed the North Sea, barely 24 carried survivors home. 3 days later, William of Normandy landed in the south of England. Harold Godwinson, exhausted from Stamford Bridge, raced his army southward. The rest belongs to a different nation's history. But Stamford Bridge belongs to Norway's. Historians have debated for generations whether a single battle can truly end an era, and the honest answer is no, not by itself. The Viking Age had been fading for decades, worn down by the spread of Christianity, the consolidation of kingdoms, the slow transformation of Scandinavian societies from raiding economies into agricultural and commercial ones. Yet Stamford Bridge concentrates all of that gradual change into a single, irreversible moment. The cultural shift already underway became permanent in the decades following 1066. Churches replaced longhouses as the centers of community life. Latin literacy spread through monastic institutions. Norwegian kings began presenting themselves not as warrior chieftains demanding tribute, but as Christian monarchs accountable to God and to Rome. The longship was not abandoned entirely, but it was no longer the primary instrument of national ambition. By 1130, when the era of the First Norwegian Civil Wars began to stir, the Norway that existed bore only surface resemblance to the one Olaf Tryggvason had forcibly baptized a century before. It was a kingdom with bishops, with written law, with a saints' cult that gave it spiritual cohesion. The men who raided Lindisfarne in 793 would not have recognized it. That, perhaps, is the most honest measure of how completely the world had turned. The transformation that followed Stamford Bridge did not produce a peaceful kingdom. It produced, instead, more than a century of bloodshed. Between 1130 and 1240, Norway descended into a grinding cycle of civil conflict that historians call the Civil War era. The disputes were partly dynastic, partly ideological. Norway had no clear law of succession, and every illegitimate son of a king carried the theoretical right to challenge for power. Faction rose against faction across generations, and the country bled through the ambitions of its competing claimants. From this chaos emerged one of the most celebrated stories in Norwegian memory. The Birkebeiner, meaning birch legs, were a rebel faction named mockingly for the birch bark strips their impoverished soldiers wrapped around their legs for warmth. They fought for the claim of young Sverre Sigurdsson, a charismatic and ruthless leader who seized the throne in 1184 after defeating and killing the reigning king. Sverre's victory did not end the wars, but it established a lineage that would eventually bring Norway to its greatest heights. That moment came with Håkon Håkonsson, who became king in 1217 at roughly 13 years old, his legitimacy disputed from the outset. What followed was a decades-long struggle to consolidate authority against rival claimants and an assertive church hierarchy that questioned his birthright. Håkon was patient and methodical where earlier kings had been impulsive. By 1240, the Civil War era ended decisively, and Norway entered a period of internal stability it had never previously enjoyed. Under Håkon IV, Norway reached the widest territorial extent in its history. The kingdom held dominion over Iceland, which submitted to Norwegian authority in 1262, followed by Greenland the following year. The Faroe Islands, Orkney, Shetland, and the Isle of Man all fell within the Norwegian sphere. At its peak, the Norwegian realm stretched across an oceanic arc from the North Sea to the edge of the known Western world. No subsequent ruler would govern as much. Bergen flourished at the center of this empire. Already Norway's largest city, it became a major node in the European trading network, exporting dried fish, furs, and timber in exchange for grain, cloth, and luxury goods from the continent. German merchants began establishing permanent footholds there, laying the groundwork for the Hanseatic League's later dominance. Bergen's harbor, busy with vessels from across northern Europe, represented something genuinely new in Norwegian life, a commercial urban culture with cosmopolitan ambitions. The same era produced an intellectual flowering. Old Norse literature reached its mature form in the 13th century, with the great saga compilations preserving the history and mythology of the Norse world. Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic scholar and statesman, wrote his prose Edda and the Heimskringla, a sweeping history of Norwegian kings between roughly 1220 and his death in 1241. The King's Mirror, a Norwegian didactic text from around 1250, reflected a sophisticated royal culture concerned with proper conduct, commercial knowledge, and the obligations of lordship. Stone churches rose across the landscape. Bergen's Håkon's Hall, completed in 1261, embodied the ambitions of a monarchy that now understood itself in fully European terms. Håkon IV died in 1263 in Orkney, returning from a failed campaign against Scotland at the Battle of Largs. His son Magnus secured a formal border treaty with Scotland 2 years later, ceding the Western Isles. The kingdom he left behind was prosperous, educated, and connected to the wider world. No one in Norway in 1263 could have predicted that within a single human lifetime, everything was about to collapse. It arrived quietly, as catastrophes often do. In the summer of 1349, an English trading vessel sailed into the harbor at Bergen. Bergen was then Norway's greatest city, its busiest port, the commercial heart of a kingdom that had spent nearly a century building itself into a genuine northern power. Ships arrived there constantly, from England, from Germany, from the Baltic. No one had particular reason to fear this one. But the ship carried more than cargo. Somewhere in its hold, or on the bodies of its crew, the bubonic plague had made the crossing. Within days of docking, people in Bergen began to die. The disease moved with terrible efficiency. Caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and spread through the bites of infected fleas carried by rats, the Black Death had already consumed perhaps a third of Europe's population before it reached Norwegian shores. Norway, cold and relatively isolated, had hoped distance might offer protection. It did not. The plague swept northward and inland through the autumn and winter, following trade routes, river valleys, and the paths between farms. By the time it burned through the country, somewhere between half and two-thirds of Norway's entire population was dead. The numbers are almost impossible to absorb. Before 1349, Norway likely held somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 people. Within 2 years, that figure may have fallen to fewer than 150,000. Entire communities simply ceased to exist. Farms that had been cultivated for generations were abandoned, their fields left to return to forest and scrub. Place names survived long after the people who had given them disappeared. What made the Norwegian catastrophe distinctly severe was which Norwegians died. The plague did not discriminate, but its effects on the administrative and aristocratic class proved particularly ruinous. Norway's nobility was already thinner and less deeply rooted than its counterparts in France or England, numbering in the hundreds rather than the thousands. When the plague killed a substantial portion of that narrow class, there was almost no one left to fill the positions of local governance, estate management, and royal administration. The machinery of the kingdom began to seize. The church suffered equally devastating losses. Priests and monks, by the nature of their duties tending to the sick and dying, died in disproportionate numbers. Monasteries lost their communities. Parishes went without clergy. The literate class that had produced the king's mirror and maintained the royal bureaucracy shrank to a shadow of its former self. What followed was not an immediate political collapse, but a slow, grinding enfeeblement. The Danish and Swedish crowns, their own losses severe, but their populations larger and their noble classes deeper, began to press into the vacuum that Norway could no longer fill. Norwegian kings found themselves ruling a kingdom with too few people to generate revenue, too few nobles to staff the administration, and too little agricultural surplus to sustain the ambitions of a genuinely independent power. The union with Denmark and Sweden, formalized through the Kalmar Union in 1397, was in many ways the institutional acknowledgement of what the plague had already accomplished. Norway did not enter that arrangement as an equal partner. It entered as the weakest of three, the kingdom most thoroughly hollowed out by the catastrophe of 1349. The abandoned farms, called the Ødegård in Norwegian, remained a visible wound on the landscape for generations. Some would not be resettled for more than a century. In remote valleys and along the coast, travelers passed the foundations of houses and the outlines of fields that no living person remembered tending. The land itself became a kind of archive of loss. Bergen would eventually recover its commercial vitality, though increasingly under the control of German Hanseatic merchants rather than Norwegian ones. The city endured. The kingdom endured. But the Norway that emerged from the Black Death was a diminished and dependent thing, and it would remain so for a very long time. The Kalmar Union would bind Norway to its Scandinavian neighbors for more than a century to come. The document that emerged from the Swedish town of Kalmar in the summer of 1397 was meant to be a triumph of Scandinavian unity. 3 kingdoms, 1 crown. The architect of this arrangement was a woman of remarkable political intelligence, Queen Margaret I of Denmark, who had already maneuvered herself into effective control of all 3 Scandinavian realms before the formal union was ever written down. Margaret had no intention of ruling through weakness. Born in 1353, she had spent decades accumulating power with a patience and precision that confounded rivals and allies alike. When the Kalmar Union was sealed, her grandnephew Eric of Pomerania was crowned King of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden in a single ceremony. Margaret remained the power behind the throne, the true architect of Northern European policy, until her death in 1412. For Norway, the Union's promise and its betrayal arrived almost simultaneously. On paper, the agreement held that each kingdom would maintain its own laws and be governed according to its own traditions. In practice, Norway's devastated institutions made such guarantees nearly impossible to enforce. Who would staff the councils? Who would argue Norway's case when Danish interests conflicted with Norwegian ones? The noble class that might have pressed those arguments had been thinned to almost nothing by a half-century of plague and demographic collapse. The result was a gradual, largely quiet displacement. Danish administrators filled positions that Norwegian candidates could not. The Royal Chancery, which handled the administrative correspondence of the Norwegian crown, was relocated to Copenhagen. Danish became the language of government and the church at the highest levels, slowly edging out the written Norwegian that had flourished in the era of the sagas and the great law codes. The Norwegian Council of the Realm still met and still passed resolutions, but its influence over actual royal policy diminished with each passing decade. Sweden watched these developments with growing hostility. Swedish nobles chafed under what they perceived as Danish domination of the Union's administration and resources. Through the 1500s, Swedish resistance intensified, producing open rebellion and cycles of brutal suppression. The union that Margaret had built was fracturing along the seam between its 2 strongest members. Norway notably did not fracture with Sweden. When Swedish frustration finally broke the Kalmar Union apart in 1523, with the election of Gustav Vasa as an independent Swedish king, Norway remained bound to Denmark. This was not simply political inertia. Denmark controlled Norway's coastlines, Norway's trade, and increasingly Norway's governing class. The choice, to whatever extent it was a choice, reflected the depth of the dependency that had grown over more than a century. The formal institutions of Norwegian independence persisted in name longer than they did in practice. The Norwegian Council of the Realm continued to exist, the laws of Magnus Lagabøte remained technically in force, and Norway retained its status as a kingdom rather than a province. But these were the shells of sovereignty rather than its substance. The people who administered Norwegian affairs answered, in the end, to Copenhagen. It is worth pausing to consider what this meant for ordinary Norwegians. The farmers along the western fjords, the fishermen of the northern coast, the traders in Bergen's narrow streets. For most of them, the identity of distant rulers mattered less than the rents they owed and the prices they received. Norway endured. Its people endured. But the confident northern kingdom that Olaf Haraldsson had united and Håkon IV had brought to genuine European prominence was now something considerably smaller. The age of Danish dominance had fully arrived, and it would not loosen its grip easily. When Gustav Vasa rode into Stockholm in 1523, Sweden was free. Norway was not. The distinction would shape Norwegian life for nearly a century and a half, pressing the kingdom ever more firmly into the shape that Copenhagen desired. The break had barely settled before the next great transformation arrived. In 1537, King Christian III of Denmark issued a decree that restructured the spiritual life of every Norwegian with a single stroke of the royal pen. Norway would become Lutheran. The Reformation, which had grown organically in Germany from Martin Luther's protests in 1517, was imposed on Norway from above by Danish royal command, with no consultation and no negotiation. The consequences were immediate and sweeping. Catholic bishops were arrested or removed from their positions. The Archbishop of Nidaros, the highest ecclesiastical authority in Norway and a figure whose office stretched back to the 12th century, was stripped of his power. Monasteries that had served as centers of learning, hospitality, and local authority for generations were dissolved, their lands seized by the crown. The accumulated spiritual and institutional infrastructure of medieval Norwegian Christianity was dismantled within years. Into that space came Lutheran pastors, Lutheran liturgy, and Lutheran scripture. All of it arrived in Danish. The Bible that Norwegian congregations now heard read from the pulpit was a Danish translation. The hymns were Danish. The official correspondence between clergy and Copenhagen was conducted in Danish. For a country whose written language had already been weakening under a century of Danish administrative pressure, this was a decisive blow. Norwegian as a formal written language effectively ceased to exist. It survived, as it always had, in the mouths of ordinary people, in the dialects of the valleys and the coastlines, in the oral traditions that no royal decree could reach. That same year, 1537, brought another quiet but profound loss. The Norwegian Council of the Realm, the body that had once advised Norwegian kings and represented Norwegian noble interests, was abolished. Norway was no longer treated as a separate kingdom in any meaningful administrative sense. It had become in practice, if not always in official language, a province of the Danish crown. Its laws, its courts, its church, and its economy were administered through Copenhagen by officials who were overwhelmingly Danish in origin and culture. What, then, remained distinctly Norwegian? The answer lay not in the halls of power, but in the land itself and the people who worked it. The Norwegian peasantry, always more numerous and more culturally coherent than the thin layer of nobility above them, continued to speak their own dialects, to organize their communities around ancient patterns of local cooperation, and to maintain a sense of who they were that no administrative language could entirely erase. The landscape itself enforced a kind of stubborn particularity. The deep fjords and steep mountain valleys that had always made central control difficult continued to shelter communities that lived by their own rhythms. A farmer in Telemark or a fisherman in the Lofoten Islands experienced Danish rule primarily as taxation and occasional legal interference, not as a transformation of daily identity. And so Norway endured this long period of subordination in a condition historians sometimes call a kind of suspended identity. The official world was Danish. The living world, rooted in soil and sea and spoken language, remained something older and more persistent. By the middle of the 17th century, the pressures of European war and shifting royal politics would begin to reshape the relationship between Norway and its distant rulers once again. The middle of the 17th century found Norway squeezed between two great powers locked in bitter, grinding rivalry. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had been fighting over the Scandinavian peninsula for generations, and the toll on Norwegian territory was becoming impossible to ignore. The treaties of Brömsebro in 1645 and Roskilde in 1658 read like a slow dismemberment. Province by province, territories that Norwegians had long inhabited passed permanently into Swedish hands. Jämtland and Härjedalen went first, then Bohuslän, the coastal region that had connected Norway's western settlements to the wider world. These were not empty borderlands. They were communities, farms, fishing grounds, and trade routes. Each loss tightened Sweden's grip on the peninsula and left Denmark-Norway strategically weakened in ways that would never fully be reversed. What did Norway have left? More than its rulers perhaps realized. While diplomats signed away territory in distant negotiating rooms, Norwegian merchants were quietly building something of their own. For 2 centuries, the Hanseatic League had dominated Bergen's famous wharf, controlling the dried fish trade that connected Norway to European markets. By the mid-1600s, that grip was loosening. Norwegian merchants, emboldened by gradual legal reforms and growing capital, began displacing German traders from their privileged positions along the docks. The counting houses and warehouses that had once operated under foreign flags increasingly flew Norwegian names above their doors. Timber became the century's great commercial engine. Dutch and British shipbuilders needed wood desperately, and Norway had forests in abundance. Norwegian sawmill owners and timber merchants responded with remarkable energy, sending vast quantities of lumber across the North Sea to feed the shipyards of Amsterdam and Bristol. The wealth this generated was real and transformative, creating a prosperous Norwegian merchant class in coastal towns that had seen nothing like it before. Then came 1660, and a transformation of a different kind. King Frederick III of Denmark, humiliated by military defeat and forced to accept a diminished kingdom, turned crisis into opportunity. He dissolved the old noble council that had constrained Danish kings for centuries and declared himself an absolute monarch, ruling by divine right alone. The change rippled northward immediately. Norway, stripped of its old council decades earlier, now found itself formally incorporated into the absolutist machinery centered in Copenhagen. Yet the outcome was not entirely what one might expect. In codifying their empire, the Danish absolutists found it useful to acknowledge Norway as a distinct realm with its own laws and administrative structures. A separate Norwegian law code was issued in 1687. Norwegian officials gained clearer defined roles. The absolutist state, in its passion for bureaucratic order, had accidentally preserved something of Norwegian institutional identity. By 1700, Norway remained subordinate, its foreign policy made in Copenhagen, its king a distant Danish monarch. But its merchants were prosperous, its forests were feeding European navies, and its people retained a stubborn sense of particular identity. The question of whether that identity might one day demand a political voice of its own was still far off. But it was no longer unthinkable. The world that had quietly nurtured Norway's merchant prosperity was about to be shattered by forces originating far to the south. In the ambitions of a single Corsican general who had made himself master of Europe, by the early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte's wars had drawn nearly every European power into conflict, and Denmark-Norway could not remain untouched. The Danish crown, calculating its interests carefully, ultimately sided with Napoleonic France. It was a fateful choice, and Norwegians would pay a price they had no voice in setting. The consequences arrived with terrible swiftness. In September of 1807, a British naval fleet appeared off the Danish coast and subjected Copenhagen to 3 days of sustained bombardment. The city burned. The Danish fleet, which Britain feared Napoleon might seize and turn against them, was captured and carried off. Denmark responded by formally allying with France against Britain. The two kingdoms were now at war with the greatest naval power on earth. For Norway, separated from Denmark by open sea, this meant catastrophe. Britain imposed a naval blockade along the Norwegian coast. Ships could not move freely. Grain, which Norway had long imported to supplement its own harvests, stopped arriving. The winters between 1807 and 1814 became years of hunger, and then something worse than hunger. Famine crept through coastal towns and inland valleys alike. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of Norwegians died from starvation and the diseases that follow it. Entire communities survived on bark bread and whatever could be scraped from exhausted soil. The prosperous merchant class that had thrived on North Sea trade watched their livelihoods dissolve. What had Copenhagen's alliance bought Norway? Nothing but suffering. Yet, even as the blockade tightened and the famine deepened, something unexpected was stirring. Cut off from Denmark by British ships, Norwegian officials found themselves making decisions on their own. A government commission established in Christiania began managing Norwegian affairs with a practical independence that had no precedent under absolutist rule. Norwegians were almost inadvertently governing themselves. They would soon need that experience. Napoleon's empire collapsed with stunning speed after his disastrous Russian campaign. By early 1814, France was beaten, and Denmark had backed the losing side. The price came in the Treaty of Kiel, signed on the 14th of January, 1814. The Danish king, Frederick VI, surrendered Norway to the Swedish crown in exchange for territories elsewhere. A kingdom that had existed for centuries was handed between monarchs like a parcel of land. But no one had asked the Norwegians. The response was immediate and defiant. Norwegian leaders rejected the transfer outright. Drawing on Enlightenment ideals that had been circulating through educated Norwegian circles for decades, they moved with remarkable speed. Delegates gathered at Eidsvoll, a manor north of Christiania, in April of 1814. They were merchants, clergy, military officers, and officials, men shaped by the very institutions that absolutism had inadvertently preserved. What they were building was nothing less than a new constitutional order. The drama unfolding at Eidsvoll that spring would produce one of the most progressive constitutional documents of its age, and a declaration of Norwegian independence that the great powers of Europe had not anticipated and could not simply ignore. The crucible of the Napoleonic Wars had done something no one planned. It had forged a Norwegian political identity ready to act. On the 17th of May, 1814, 112 men gathered at Eidsvoll Manor and did something that reverberated across the continent. They signed a constitution. The building itself was elegant but modest, a manor house belonging to ironworks owner Carsten Anker, set against the quiet hills north of Christiania. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but quiet. For weeks, delegates had argued, negotiated, and debated through cold spring mornings and candlelit evenings. They had arrived representing different interests, different regions, different visions. What united them was a shared conviction that Norway's fate could not simply be traded away by kings who had never asked what Norwegians wanted. The document they produced was extraordinary by any measure. At a time when most of Europe remained under the grip of monarchical absolutism or the chaos of post-Napoleonic reaction, the Norwegian constitution enshrined principles that were startlingly modern. Popular sovereignty sat at its heart. The power of the state derived from the people, not from divine right. A separation of powers divided authority between a legislature called the Storting, an executive, and an independent judiciary. Freedom of speech and protection from arbitrary arrest were written into its pages. Property rights were guaranteed. It was, in short, one of the most liberal constitutional frameworks in the world in 1814. Scholars still rank it among the landmark constitutional documents of the entire 19th century. The assembly also made a practical political decision. They needed a king, and they chose Christian Frederick, the Danish prince who had helped organize the resistance to the Kiel Treaty. On the same day they signed the constitution, he was elected King of Norway, his authority resting not on hereditary right alone, but on the explicit consent of Norwegian representatives. The symbolism was deliberate. This was a different kind of monarchy. But the great powers of Europe were not impressed by symbolism. Sweden, led by Crown Prince Carl Johan, the former French Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, held a treaty right to Norway and was not prepared to surrender it. Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, all exhausted by war and deeply suspicious of anything that smelled like revolutionary upheaval, supported the Swedish claim. Norway's declaration of independence was, diplomatically speaking, almost entirely isolated. War came in the summer. Swedish forces crossed the border in late July, and the conflict that followed was brief, sharp, and ultimately decisive. The Norwegian army fought with genuine determination, but the military realities were impossible to ignore. Sweden's forces were larger, better supplied, and backed by great power legitimacy. By August, both sides accepted that further bloodshed served no purpose. On the 14th of August, 1814, the Convention of Moss brought the fighting to a close. The terms were painful but contained a crucial concession. Sweden would not simply absorb Norway as a conquered province. Norway would enter a personal union with Sweden, sharing a king, but retaining its own constitution, its own Storting, and its own internal governance. Christian Frederick abdicated, as the agreement required. But the Constitution, that document signed on the 17th of May, survived. It survived because Carl Johan and the Swedish negotiators recognized something important. Crushing the Constitution entirely would produce endless resistance. Better to accept Norwegian autonomy in internal affairs and secure the union they needed. In November of 1814, the Storting elected the Swedish King Karl XIII as King of Norway, formally completing the union. Norway was not independent in the fullest sense, but it was not simply a province either. It occupied a strange, contested middle ground, a kingdom with its own laws and institutions, its own parliament, embedded within a larger union it had never chosen. The 17th of May became, and remains, Norway's National Day. Not the day independence was finally secured, but the day Norwegians first declared who they were and what they believed. That act of self-definition, forged in a manor house in the spring of 1814, proved more durable than any army or any treaty. What would Norway make of this fragile autonomy in the decades ahead? The union with Sweden would test that question in ways no one at Eidsvoll could yet foresee. The union with Sweden was, from its first day, an arrangement built on tension. Norwegians had not chosen it. They had accepted it reluctantly, under the pressure of military reality and diplomatic isolation. The shared monarch sat in Stockholm. The Norwegian Storting sat in Christiania. And between those two centers of power, a slow, determined struggle for self-governance would unfold across 9 decades. The constitutional framework of the Union gave Norwegians genuine room to govern themselves. The Storting controlled domestic legislation, taxation, and internal affairs. Sweden handled foreign policy. It was an awkward arrangement, frequently disputed, but it gave Norwegian democracy something invaluable: space to grow. Through the middle decades of the 19th century, the Storting steadily expanded its authority, pushing back against royal prerogative whenever opportunity arose. By 1884, a genuine parliamentary system had taken hold, forcing the king's ministers to answer to the legislature rather than to the crown alone. It was a quiet constitutional revolution, won not on a battlefield but through persistent legislative pressure. While politicians argued in Christiania, something equally powerful was happening in the culture. Norwegians were rediscovering themselves. The Romantic nationalist movement that swept Europe in the 1800s arrived in Norway with particular force, because here it had a specific political purpose: to prove that Norway was a real and ancient nation, not merely a Swedish province waiting to be absorbed. Poets led the charge. Henrik Wergeland, passionate and prolific, threw himself into the project of building a Norwegian national consciousness, celebrating the landscape, the common people, and the ideals of the Eidsvoll Constitution. His rival and sparring partner, Johann Sebastian Welhaven, argued for a more refined cultural vision rooted in the Scandinavian tradition, but the argument itself was evidence of a lively, self-aware literary culture. Composers, painters, and folklorists followed. Edvard Grieg set Norwegian folk melodies into music that carried the sound of fjords and mountains to concert halls across Europe. Henrik Ibsen dissected Norwegian society with a dramatic precision that made audiences everywhere uncomfortable. Language became another battleground. For centuries, written Norwegian had been essentially Danish. Ivor Assen, a largely self-educated linguist from Western Norway, spent years traveling the countryside in the 1840s and 50s, collecting dialects and speech patterns from rural communities. From this material, he constructed landsmål, later called Nynorsk, a written language built on the native Norwegian vernacular. It was a political as much as a linguistic act. 2 official written languages now existed in Norway, a situation that persists to the present day and reflects just how seriously Norwegians took the question of who they were and how they spoke. Yet for nearly 900,000 Norwegians, the answer to hardship was not political struggle but emigration. Between roughly 1825 and 1900, waves of Norwegians crossed the Atlantic, most of them bound for the American Midwest. Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakotas received entire communities transplanted from the western fjords and inland valleys. The reasons were practical. Too little farmland, too many mouths, too few opportunities. They carried their language, their Lutheran faith, and their customs with them, planting Norwegian names across the American prairie that still appear on maps today. Those who stayed at home carried a growing conviction that the union with Sweden, however functional it had become, was no longer sufficient. Norway had its own constitution, its own culture, its own language, its own people streaming to the other side of the world rather than accept a constrained future. The question of full independence was no longer distant. It was becoming unavoidable. The crisis, when it finally came, turned on something almost mundane. Norway wanted its own consular service, separate offices abroad to represent Norwegian shipping interests rather than sharing Swedish diplomatic representation. It was a practical demand from a nation whose merchant fleet had become one of the largest in the world. Sweden refused. And in refusing, Sweden handed Norwegian nationalists the argument they had been waiting for. On June 7, 1905, the Norwegian Storting met in Christiania and passed a declaration that would echo across the country like a thunderclap. The union with Sweden, the parliament declared, was dissolved. King Oscar II, who served as monarch of both nations, had ceased to function as King of Norway. In a single legislative act, nearly a century of union was formally ended. Was this legal? Sweden disputed it immediately, and the standoff that followed was genuinely tense. Swedish military planners examined their options. Norwegian border fortifications were quietly reinforced. For several weeks, the possibility of armed conflict hung in the air like smoke before a storm. But cooler heads prevailed on both sides. Sweden agreed to negotiations on one condition. Norway must demonstrate that its people actually wanted independence. The Storting agreed to a national plebiscite. On August 13, 1905, Norwegian men went to the polls in overwhelming numbers. The result was stunning even by the standards of a foregone conclusion. 368,208 votes were cast in favor of independence. Only 184 voted against. It was not a decision. It was a declaration of an entire people speaking with one voice. Armed with that mandate, Norwegian and Swedish delegations met in the Swedish city of Karlstad through the late summer. The negotiations were difficult, with disputes over border fortifications and neutral zones. But by September 23rd, they had produced the Karlstad Convention. Sweden recognized Norwegian independence. The union that had begun under military pressure in 1814 ended 91 years later through diplomacy. One question remained. Norway was now a kingdom without a king. The Storting had offered the throne first to a Swedish prince, who declined, and then turned their attention to Prince Karl of Denmark, a young naval officer married to Princess Maud of Great Britain, daughter of King Edward VII. Karl was sensible enough to insist on his own plebiscite before accepting. Norwegians voted again in November, and this time the question was monarchy versus republic. The monarchy won comfortably. Prince Karl arrived in Norway, took the Old Norse name Hakon, and was crowned Hakon VII. His infant son was named Olav. Norway had a royal family that was, in the most literal sense, chosen by its people. International recognition followed swiftly. The great powers of Europe, including Britain, France, Germany, and Russia, formally acknowledged the new Norwegian state before the year was out. A nation that had last governed itself independently in the 14th century stepped onto the world stage in 1905 with a democratic constitution, a chosen king, and a merchant fleet that circled the globe. For Norwegians, it was a moment of extraordinary emotional weight. The long patience had paid off. 5 centuries of Danish administration and nearly a century of Swedish union had not erased who they were. They had preserved their language, built their institutions, and waited for their moment. What awaited them in the new century, however, would test that hard-won independence in ways that no one gathered in Christiania that autumn could have imagined. Independence, it turned out, was only the beginning of the work. The new Norwegian state inherited a country still largely rural, its economy tilted toward fishing, timber, and the carrying trade. But beneath the mountains ran something extraordinary: water. Thousands of feet of elevation, relentless rainfall, and rivers carved by ancient glaciers gave Norway some of the most powerful hydroelectric potential on Earth. Engineers and investors recognized it almost immediately. By 1920, Norway had harnessed more hydroelectric power per capita than any other nation on the planet. Aluminum smelters, electrochemical plants, and paper mills rose along the fjords, their smokestacks rising beside waterfalls. A country that had exported raw materials began exporting finished goods. Towns that barely existed in 1905 became industrial centers within a generation. Progress on the social front moved with equal speed. In 1913, Norway extended full voting rights to women, making it one of the first independent nations in Europe to do so. The suffrage movement had been building for decades, and the new state, still defining itself, proved willing to listen. Norwegian women did not simply win a symbolic right. They stepped into political life quickly, shaping debates over education, public health, and social welfare. Then came the war. Norway declared neutrality in 1914, as it had every strategic and economic reason to do. The country was small, recently independent, and deeply integrated into international trade. But neutrality in a world at total war proved a brutal bargain. The Norwegian merchant fleet, one of the largest in the world, continued sailing. German submarines did not distinguish between belligerents and neutrals. By the time the armistice came in 1918, roughly half the Norwegian merchant fleet had been sunk. More than 2,000 Norwegian sailors lost their lives. They had no army in the field, no front to point to. Their sacrifice happened quietly, in cold Atlantic waters, largely unremembered outside their own country. The interwar years brought new turbulence. Global commodity prices collapsed after the war, and Norway, dependent on shipping and export industries, suffered badly through the 1920s. Unemployment climbed. Labor disputes shook the docks and the factories. Out of this economic pain, the labor movement grew powerful, and through the 1930s, the Norwegian Labour Party began assembling what would become the architecture of a Scandinavian welfare state, building systems for unemployment insurance, workers' rights, and social support that would define the country for the rest of the century. Against this backdrop of industrial transformation and political struggle, one Norwegian captured the world's imagination in a more elemental way. On December 14, 1911, Roald Amundsen and his team planted the Norwegian flag at the South Pole, beating the British expedition of Robert Falcon Scott by 34 days. For a young nation still establishing its identity, the achievement felt like proof of something. That Norwegian endurance, skill, and determination belonged on the world stage. That stage, however, was about to grow far more dangerous. The warning signs had been visible for months. German naval vessels had been observed in Norwegian waters. Intelligence reports circulated through Oslo. Yet, when April 9, 1940 arrived, Norway was not ready. In the early hours of that Tuesday morning, German warships entered the Oslofjord under cover of darkness and fog. Operation Weserübung, Hitler's audacious plan to seize Norway and Denmark simultaneously, was underway. The strategic logic was cold and clear. Norway's long coastline offered Germany access to the North Atlantic. Its ports would keep the vital iron ore supply lines from Sweden open. And in British hands, Norway would be a dagger aimed at the German heartland. What the Germans did not expect was the Oscarsborg fortress. As the German heavy cruiser Blücher moved through the narrow waters south of Oslo, the fortress guns opened fire. It was shortly after 5 in the morning. 2 artillery shells struck the Blücher directly. Torpedoes followed. The pride of the German Navy, carrying hundreds of troops and Gestapo officers intended to arrest the Norwegian government, rolled and sank in the cold fjord water. Over 800 German sailors and soldiers died. The delay bought precious hours. Those hours mattered enormously. King Haakon VII, the royal family, members of the government, and the Bank of Norway's gold reserves were loaded onto trains and moved north from Oslo before German forces could close the trap. When German ambassador Kurt Breuer demanded that King Haakon legitimize the occupation and accept a government led by the Norwegian fascist Vidkun Quisling, the king refused. Not privately and not quietly. He told his government he would abdicate before lending his name to such an arrangement. His ministers, moved by the old king's resolve, backed him completely. The refusal echoed across a stunned nation. The government continued retreating northward, broadcasting defiance, trying to organize resistance from a country that had not fought a war in over a century. British and French forces landed at several points along the Norwegian coast, and for a few weeks the outcome genuinely hung in the balance. The fiercest fighting centered on Narvik, the northern port through which Swedish iron ore flowed to Germany. 2 separate naval battles in the Ofotfjord destroyed 10 German destroyers, a significant blow. Allied ground forces eventually retook the town itself in late May, the first successful land offensive against Germany in the entire war. But events elsewhere made the Norwegian campaign irrelevant. On May 10th, Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. Allied troops desperately needed elsewhere were evacuated from Norway. The brief hope of resistance collapsed. King Haakon made one final broadcast from Norwegian soil on June 7, 1940, before boarding a British cruiser at Tromsø. He promised he would return. The Norwegian government continued in exile in London, where the king became a symbol around which occupied Norway could organize its defiance and its dignity. Norway fell, but it did not surrender its identity. The 5 years ahead would test that distinction in ways no one on that June morning could yet fully imagine. The Germans had conquered a coastline. They had not conquered a people. And the man who would attempt to make that occupation function to reshape Norway into something the Third Reich could use and control was already waiting in Oslo. His name would become, in almost every language on Earth, a synonym for collaboration and betrayal. Vidkun Quisling had waited years for his moment. The leader of the small fascist National Samling Party, he had failed repeatedly at the ballot box, never winning more than a fraction of Norwegian votes. Now German bayonets gave him what democracy had denied him. His puppet government, installed in February 1942, answered to Reichskommissar Joseph Terboven, the true power in occupied Norway, a hard and ruthless administrator who reported directly to Hitler. Quisling could issue decrees. Terboven could override any of them. The arrangement fooled nobody, least of all Norwegians. The occupation pressed down on daily life in ways both large and small. Food was rationed. Press freedom vanished. Teachers were ordered to join a fascist organization and refused en masse. Thousands of them arrested or sent to labor camps in the north. The Lutheran clergy stood publicly against the regime. The resistance that King Haakon had promised was not merely military. It was cultural, moral, and stubborn. The darkest chapter of those 5 years unfolded in the autumn of 1942. Norway's Jewish community numbered roughly 2,000 people. Under orders coordinated between Norwegian police and German authorities, arrests began in October. On November 26th, the cargo ship Gotenland and then the SS Gotenland's larger companion, the Donau, departed Oslo carrying 773 Jewish men, women, and children. They were transported to Auschwitz. Almost none survived. Roughly half of Norwegian Jews perished in the Holocaust, a crime in which Norwegian state institutions bore direct responsibility, a reckoning the country would spend decades confronting honestly. Against this darkness, resistance grew. The military organization known as Milorg quietly assembled a clandestine army inside Norway, coordinating with the government in London and Britain's Special Operations Executive. Saboteurs cut rail lines, disrupted German supply chains, and passed intelligence across the North Sea in small boats through treacherous winter waters. The single most consequential act of sabotage came in February 1943. The Vemork hydroelectric plant in Telemark produced heavy water, a substance essential to the German nuclear weapons program. If Germany developed an atomic bomb first, the consequences for the entire war were almost unthinkable. A team of Norwegian commandos, trained in Britain and inserted by parachute into the frozen Hardangervidda plateau, descended on the plant at night, navigated a near-vertical gorge the Germans had considered impassable, and destroyed the heavy water production facility without losing a single man. The operation, known as Gunnerside, set the German atomic program back by critical months and stands today as one of the most daring special operations missions of the entire war. Meanwhile, Norway's contribution to Allied victory stretched across every ocean. When the Germans invaded, the Norwegian merchant fleet was the fourth largest in the world. Rather than surrender those ships, the Norwegian government in exile placed them under Allied command through a company called Nortraship. 930 vessels carried oil, troops, and supplies across the Atlantic under constant threat from German submarines. Over 3,000 Norwegian sailors died at sea. Their contribution to keeping Britain supplied and the Allied war machine running was immense and, for many years, insufficiently recognized. By the spring of 1945, the German position in Norway had become untenable. The Reich was collapsing on all fronts. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. King Haakon VII sailed home to Oslo on June 7th, 5 years to the day from his departure. The crowds that lined the streets were enormous, weeping and cheering at once. Norway had endured. The question now was how a nation rebuilds itself and what it chooses to remember. The cheering on June 7th had barely faded before Norway faced the full weight of what rebuilding actually meant. Liberation was a beginning, not an ending. Justice came first. Vidkun Quisling stood trial in August 1945, charged with treason and complicity in murder. The proceedings were brief and the verdict was never truly in doubt. On October 24th, Quisling was executed by firing squad at Akershus fortress in Oslo. He remains the most notorious Norwegian in history, a name so synonymous with betrayal that his surname entered languages worldwide as a common noun. Roughly 90,000 Norwegians faced some form of legal proceedings for collaboration, the largest purge in Scandinavian history. Most received fines or short sentences, but the trials forced a painful national conversation about complicity, one that would simmer for generations. In the far north, the scale of destruction was almost incomprehensible. As German forces retreated through Finnmark and northern Troms in the autumn of 1944, they implemented a scorched earth policy of deliberate methodical ruin. Entire towns were burned to the ground. Kirkens, Vadsø, Hammerfest, all reduced to ash and rubble. Roughly 50,000 civilians were forcibly evacuated. Those who refused hid in caves through the Arctic winter. When Norwegian authorities finally arrived, they found a landscape stripped of nearly everything. Rebuilding Finnmark would consume enormous resources and political will throughout the late 1940s and into the 50s, a reconstruction effort that reshaped the entire region. Norway's pre-war tradition had been neutrality, a policy that April 9, 1940 had demolished completely. The lesson was clear to most Norwegian leaders. Small nations could not protect themselves alone. When the United States began organizing a collective Western defense structure in 1948 and 49, Norway made a decision that would define its foreign policy for the rest of the century. In April 1949, Norway became one of the 12 founding members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Neutrality was finished. Geography alone made Norway strategically vital, sharing a long border with the Soviet Union in the Kola Peninsula region, home to the Soviet Northern Fleet. Economic recovery moved with surprising speed. American aid through the Marshall Plan, which Norway joined in 1948, injected critical capital into rebuilding infrastructure and industry. Norwegian planners combined this foreign assistance with an ambitious domestic program of centralized economic management under labor governments that would hold power for most of the post-war period. By the mid-1950s, living standards were rising steadily, and the sense of national purpose was almost tangible. By the late 1960s, Norway had rebuilt itself into a stable, prosperous social democracy anchored firmly in the Western Alliance. Few could have imagined in those ash-filled ruins of Finnmark just 2 decades earlier how complete the transformation would be. And yet the greatest transformation of all was still approaching, waiting beneath the North Sea floor. On December 23, 1969, engineers working for Phillips Petroleum confirmed what early drilling had only hinted at. Beneath the gray waters of the North Sea, roughly 300 kilometers southwest of Stavanger, lay one of the largest offshore oil fields ever discovered. They called it Ekofisk. Norway, a nation of fishermen and sailors, suddenly found itself sitting atop an ocean of black gold. The timing was almost cinematic. Within 4 years, the 1973 Arab oil embargo sent global energy prices soaring, and Norway's underwater reserves transformed overnight from a promising discovery into a geopolitical asset of the first order. Royalties and licensing fees began flowing into Oslo. The question was not whether Norway would grow wealthy. The question was what kind of wealthy Norway intended to become. The answer came through deliberate policy rather than accident. In 1972, the Norwegian government established Statoil, a state-owned company designed to ensure that Norwegians, not foreign corporations alone, would control and profit from their own natural resources. The so-called Norwegian model built strict government oversight directly into the petroleum industry. Production licenses required foreign companies to work alongside Norwegian partners, transferring expertise and technology. The state would participate in every significant field, learning the business from the inside while collecting its share of revenues from the outside. This was not simply nationalism. It was a conscious rejection of the resource curse that had hollowed out other petroleum economies, where oil wealth enriched elites while ordinary citizens saw little benefit and industries beyond oil withered from neglect. But wealth extracted from the sea carried mortal risks that no policy document could fully account for. On March 27, 1980, the Alexander Kielland, a floating accommodation platform housing workers on the Ekofisk field, collapsed during a storm in the North Sea. 123 men died. It remains Norway's worst offshore disaster. The catastrophe exposed serious failures in safety certification and emergency procedures, and it forced the industry into a sweeping overhaul of offshore regulations. Norwegian petroleum safety standards, rebuilt in the shadow of Kielland, would eventually become a global benchmark. The accident also deepened a conversation that would grow louder with each passing decade. Could a nation simultaneously champion environmental responsibility and extract fossil fuels at industrial scale? Norway's political culture held both values with genuine conviction, and the tension between them never entirely resolved. What did resolve, at least in structural terms, was the question of what to do with the money. In 1990, Norway established the framework for what would eventually become the Government Pension Fund Global, commonly known simply as the Oil Fund. Rather than spending petroleum revenues directly into the economy, where they risked fueling inflation and dependency, Norway would invest them abroad on behalf of future generations. The principle was elegant and almost radical in its patience. The oil belonged not just to the Norwegians alive today, but to those not yet born. By the late 1980s, the architecture of a new Norway was visible. Stavanger had grown from a quiet coastal town into an international oil hub. Norwegian engineers had mastered technologies that barely existed when Ekofisk was first drilled. And the revenues accumulating in state coffers promised a welfare state more secure than almost any other on Earth. The black gold beneath the North Sea had not merely made Norway richer. It had given Norwegians a choice about who they wanted to be, and they had chosen carefully. How that choice would shape the nation through the turbulence of the coming decades was a question still being written. The oil fund was a promise made to the future. But the Norway of the 1990s still had to govern itself in the present, and few questions proved more contentious than the one that had divided the country for a generation. Should Norway join the European Union? It had already said no once, in 1972, when voters rejected membership by a margin that stunned political establishments across Western Europe. 2 decades later, with the Cold War over and Europe reorganizing itself around the Maastricht Treaty, the question returned. Norwegian leaders argued that full membership offered economic integration and political influence. A majority of citizens disagreed. In the November 1994 referendum, 52.2% voted no. Norway would remain outside the Union, bound to European markets through the European Economic Area Agreement, but sovereign in its own right. It was a democratic verdict that shaped everything that followed. What Norway built inside that sovereignty was remarkable by almost any measure. The welfare state, already substantial, was refined into something approaching comprehensive. Universal health care, free university education, generous parental leave, and robust unemployment protections formed a social architecture that consistently ranked among the world's finest. The model rested on high taxation, strong trade unions, and a cultural consensus that collective security was worth collective sacrifice. It did not emerge without debate, and it was never static, but it endured. So did a commitment to the wider world. Oslo became synonymous with diplomatic ambition. Norwegian mediators helped broker the Oslo Accords between Israelis and Palestinians in 1993, and Norwegian facilitation touched conflicts from Sri Lanka to Colombia. The Nobel Peace Prize, administered from Oslo, gave the country a platform that belied its modest population of roughly 5 million. Then came July 22, 2011. That afternoon, a car bomb tore through the government quarter in Oslo, killing 8 people. As rescue workers responded, a gunman arrived at Utøya Island, where the Labour Party Youth Wing was holding its annual summer camp. Anders Behring Breivik killed 69 people there, most of them teenagers. 77 dead in total. It was the worst act of violence in Norway since the Second World War, and it came not from abroad but from within. The national response was deliberate and, to many observers, extraordinary. Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg promised more democracy, not less. Courts tried Breivik openly within the ordinary criminal justice system. Grief was immense in public. Norway chose to mourn without dismantling the open society Breivik had targeted. The attack also forced a reckoning with questions about extremism, identity, and immigration that Norwegian society had been navigating for years. Demographic transformation driven by immigration from South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa had changed the face of Norwegian cities. How to integrate newcomers while preserving social cohesion became one of the defining political tensions of the era. Norway entered the 2020s prosperous, complex, and still asking the hardest questions about what it meant to be Norwegian in a changing world. What does it mean to be a small nation with an outsized conscience? Norway in the 2020s offers one answer. Year after year, the United Nations Human Development Index places Norway at or near the very top of its global rankings, measuring life expectancy, education, and standard of living across nearly 200 countries. A child born in Norway today can expect the kind of life that would have been unimaginable to the fishermen and farmers who scraped existence from these fjords a century ago. The Sovereign Wealth Fund, grown to over $1 trillion in value, stands as perhaps the most ambitious act of collective saving in human history, a cushion built from petroleum, but intended to outlast it. And yet the oil question refuses to rest. Norway produces roughly 2 million barrels per day, and that production funds the very welfare state that Norwegians treasure. But glaciers are retreating in Svalbard. Arctic temperatures are rising at nearly 4 times the global average. The country that built wind turbines for the world still pumps hydrocarbons from the seabed, and the tension between those two identities sits at the center of Norwegian political life. Young climate activists march in Oslo. Oil workers in Stavanger argue their industry still feeds families. There is no easy resolution, only the grinding work of transition, with Norway betting heavily on offshore wind, green hydrogen, and carbon capture as the industries that might eventually replace what the North Sea once provided. In the far north, a different and older reckoning continues. The Sami people, indigenous to a territory spanning northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, have seen their language rights, land claims, and cultural institutions gain formal recognition over recent decades. The Samdigi, Norway's Sami parliament, now holds genuine legislative influence over matters affecting indigenous communities. Yet disputes over mining rights and wind farm construction on traditional reindeer grazing lands remind everyone that recognition on paper and justice in practice are not always the same thing. Geopolitics, too, has returned to these latitudes with force. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 sent tremors through a country that shares a land border with Russia in the far northeast. Norway quietly reinforced its commitments to NATO, its founding membership now feeling less like history and more like present necessity. The Arctic, long a space of cautious international cooperation, has become a theater of strategic competition, with Norway watching carefully from its position as the alliance's northernmost member. 1,000 years of history distilled into the present moment reveals something consistent in the Norwegian character: an insistence on surviving, adapting, and building something lasting from whatever the land and sea provide. From Viking longships navigating unknown waters to engineers designing wind turbines in Arctic gales, the instinct remains the same. The landscape still shapes the people. The people still argue fiercely about the future. And the midnight sun still rises over a nation that has never stopped becoming itself. Norway's 1,000-year journey from Norse shores to modern democracy proves that resilience, not conquest, defines a nation's truest legacy. Subscribe for more epic histories like this one.